learning multiple languages at the same time is a balancing act. So right now I'm learning Japanese and Hungarian at the same time. But long ago I was learning French and Spanish at the same time, and it was such a struggle that I ended up just quitting Spanish. So you see, French was the first language that I ever learned. And when I jumped into Spanish, I was kind of expecting a lot of the same thing. But when I started learning multiple languages at the same time, I didn't understand that fundamentally how I approach language learning would need to change. Now, years later, I have a much better understanding of how to juggle multiple languages as well as add in new ones along the way. Now, before we talk about how to balance multiple languages, I thought this would be a good time to sort of debunk this myth that I see out there that you can't learn multiple languages at the same time. Because I have very specific things that I would like to say on that, and I think that some of what I have to say might not be something that you've heard before, and it might actually benefit you or give you a different perspective on language learning. So one of the biggest things that I hear people say about, why you cannot or why you should not study the multiple languages at the same time is specifically people will talk about studying related languages at the same time. Like, so for example, I learned French first, and in the process of learning French, I also started learning Spanish at the same time. And now I already told you guys that I ended up quitting Spanish, but this was so early on in my language learning journey. And I didn't know everything back then that I do now. But obviously at that time, when I was learning French and Spanish, the languages were just very similar, and I was more dominant with French because I had been studying that one longer. That when I started learning Spanish, I was mixing up with Spanish. So for example, in my Spanish class, my professor actually spoke both of those languages, and he would call out like, Sarah, that pronunciation, that's a little French, or no, that's the French way of spelling, that's not Spanish. And because I wasn't so confident in how to form the conjugations of different verbs in Spanish, when in doubt, my brain would just kind of see that this verb is very similar to French, and then I would start to conjugate it in a French way and get really confused. And so obviously, learning Spanish, I was constantly fighting against the French in my head. And that made it a lot harder to learn Spanish at that time than if it was the only language I was learning, or if I had never known French in the first place and just focused on Spanish. That was the mindset at that time that I had. And all of these reasons are more or less why people say specifically you should not study similar or related languages at the same time. But I kind of disagree. And in order to understand that, first I want to talk about something called language mixing. So as you can tell already from my description of my experience learning Spanish and French, that one of the biggest challenges I had with Spanish was that I was mixing French into Spanish. But the thing was, I wasn't mixing Spanish into French. And that's because at that time, I was already at least an intermediate to advanced speaker of French. And with Spanish, since it was so new to me and it wasn't really drilled into my brain yet, at that time when my brain thought, we need to find some sort of word for this, and when my brain spent time searching for words, it kind of just reached out for something foreign. And at that time, because French was more top of my head for me, it would pull out French. And then years later, I started learning Korean, and then I moved to Korea. And then because I was living in Korea, I had to use the language a lot in day-to-day life, that at some point, even though my Korean compared to my French wasn't as high level, at some point it became more dominant in my head, because in my day-to-day life, I needed to pull out Korean words, phrases, and interact in Korean. So when it came to time to speaking a foreign language, it was usually Korean. And then I noticed something very peculiar, because when I came to Korea, at some point I decided to try to spend some time keeping up my French studies. And when I first started to use French again while living in Korea, the same thing that happened with my Spanish happened with French. Now, I would go and speak French with somebody, or I took a class and I would use French in the class, and then when I struggled to think of the word that I needed, a Korean word would come out. And it would come out so fast that I wasn't even thinking about it. And I would stop and think, wait, that's not French. I just spoke Korean and put a Korean word into a French sentence. Now, I had quit learning Spanish because I thought that, all of that French getting thrown into my Spanish was because the languages were just too similar. But then when this started happening where I was throwing Korean into my French, I kind of thought, well, this doesn't make any sense because these languages have really nothing in common with each other. So what is going on here? And you know, this made me really curious. And so I started to think about how bilinguals learn languages. And, you know, based on like, stories I heard from friends and my own personal experience working with kids here in South Korea, teaching English, I do come across children who are being raised bilingual in Korean and English. And so from my experiences in my career, as well as from stories of people that I know who were raised bilingual, I got really curious and I started to notice some patterns. So first, I want to give you guys a story. Now, this is a true story based off of somebody that I know and their life experience. I'm just going to call this person Erica, just for their privacy. So Erica would go to her grandma's house and her grandma would speak Italian to her. Now, Erica was American and she grew up in America. But because her grandma was Italian, her grandma would speak to her in Italian, and then she would take her to school where Erica would have to speak in English to her teachers and her classmates. Now, the problem was that Erica would communicate with her grandma, and she understood how to express certain needs, ask for water and different things in Italian. And then she would go to school, and sometimes she would only have this Italian word for things. And there was a lot of communication issues because sometimes she would go to her teachers and say, you know, I want, and an Italian word would come out and they wouldn't know what that meant. And she would get really frustrated and just keep repeating it. So her family thought maybe this is going to be too stressful for her to try to learn these two languages at the same time because it's going to create communication problems at school. And so her family decided not to teach her Italian. But this is actually very common for bilingual kids because they are learning two languages at the same time. They will learn a lot of different words and expressions across these two languages. And for a time period in their development, they might mix these languages a little bit and get confused. But that's very normal. And as time goes on, they start to develop a sense of being able to contain the two languages to the correct context. So at some point, they will understand that, you know, these two languages are separate, and they will understand in certain contexts to use this language like Italian and to use this language like English. So for some time in a child's development, a child who is being raised bilingual, it will be normal that sometimes they'll have an experience like that. So unfortunately for Erica, there is a huge possibility that if her family just continued down that path, that she would eventually have just kind of sorted it out and she would be able to speak both of those languages pretty comfortably and in the right social context. Now, the key thing that I want you to take away from this story is that code switching or mixing up languages is a very normal part of language learning, even for bilingual speakers. So going back to my experience with Korean and French, and when I started to use Korean a lot more in my daily life, when I would go to speak French, the fact that the Korean would enter into my French really confused me because they were not related at all. And because I had already quit Spanish years ago because of a similar experience, you know, this time I was not willing to give up. And so you know what I did? I just kept going anyway. And funnily enough, one day it just stopped. And it has not come back ever since. It was like eventually over time, my brain got really good at understanding that it needed to contain these languages. When I'm speaking Korean, we need to only use Korean. And when I'm speaking French, even when we're struggling, even when we don't know what words to say, the brain is really good at sticking to French or just saying, I don't know. And I've noticed now that when I do get stuck in Korean or in French or in another language, my brain doesn't by accident pull out words from another language. And if I'm so stuck and I feel like I could use English to ask the person, then I actually make a conscious choice to say something in English. It's not by accident and it's not just being thrown out there randomly. I have a much better control over when I'm using which language. And then eventually I started to learn Japanese, and Japanese is very similar to Korean. So you might guess that this problem of mixing the languages might show up. No. I really have no problem isolating Japanese from Korean, and I've even been learning Japanese in Korean, which sounds like it could be really confusing, and yet it's not. And then I started to learn Hungarian at the same time that I'm learning Japanese, and they're not that related, but I'm a beginner in both of them. And again, I don't have any issues of mixing any language into another language. So what's basically happening is something called inhibitory control. Basically, your brain at some point will develop the ability to turn off your native language and contain the languages that you speak. So when you're speaking in your native language, it's only your native language. When you're speaking in this other language, it's only the other language. And this is something that bilingual kids will eventually develop in their journey of learning languages, is the ability to discern in what context to use one language and to isolate that language. Now in Erica's story, for example, she likely had not fully developed that inhibitory control. But if she were to have kept learning Italian, it is likely that very quickly she would have developed that skill and she would no longer have this issue of mixing the languages so much. Basically, if you want to get better at using multiple languages and learning multiple languages at the same time, and you want to avoid mixing them up so much, you have to go through the experience of mixing them up in order to get better at containing them. And eventually, as you power through that mixing up of the languages will fade. And now this is personally why I just think that you should not give up on learning similar languages or multiple languages at the same time, especially if they are just languages you're really interested in. And also, I know a lot of people will go to school and get degrees in foreign languages, and when people do this, they often will study more than one, and people tend to study similar languages in school and are in situations where it is unavoidable that they need to study multiple languages at the same time, and they actually need to study similar languages at the same time. If you're avoiding learning multiple languages at the same time or picking up new languages because they're too similar or your level in them is too beginner, I say don't overthink it, because yeah, mixing them up might be a real thing you experience, but if you keep going, that I believe is going to stop. And why hold off on something you want to do? Just do it, you know? So when it comes to learning 2 languages at the same time or more, the first thing that you have to do is you have to accept that you will be dividing your time across these languages. Now, if you were to focus on one language only, then yeah, in a certain amount of time, you would probably get better at that language because you spent more hours, more frequency on it. But if you want to learn multiple languages at the same time, obviously you have a fixed amount of time that you can spend, and you're going to have to share that. So you're not going to be able to progress in either of the languages as fast as you would if you only focused on one, and you have to just accept that. Now, you could just focus on one language for a while and get good at that language to maybe intermediate level before starting another one. But then the reality is that that could mean putting off a language for a year or more just while you're focusing on the other. And it really just depends on your interests and your priorities whether you want to do that or not. There's nothing wrong with doing one language at a time and getting to like a better level and then switching to another one and stacking them that way. But you don't have to do that. If you really are excited about 2 languages right now and you like can't decide which one to do, you can do both. For example, in my situation, I really want to focus hard on Hungarian because I'm ethnically a Hungarian person, and it is really important to me to basically like relearn this language that my family did not teach me. And in the process of learning this language, because of my like ethnic background as a Hungarian person, I can go and apply for Hungarian citizenship. And I really want to do that as soon as possible because, you know, it's like my heritage, it's my identity, it's my family's language, and I also have this fear of, you know, you never know what happens. What if laws change and this opportunity to get citizenship changes one day? So I really want to lock in Hungarian and, you know, get to a point where I can apply for my citizenship so I can just have that done. So it's a huge priority for me to learn Hungarian. But I also live in Asia. I live in South Korea, and I really am so interested in Japan and Japanese culture and the Japanese language. And because it is so close to me, whenever I have like a long weekend or a vacation, it's very easy for me to fly to Japan for very short, very last minute trips. And you know, with that access to Japan, it feels like it would be a shame if I were to hold off studying Japanese and then maybe one day I have to leave Korea for some reason. And I miss out on all that opportunity to have learned Japanese and like used it in all these trips to Japan. So I kind of felt, you know, I have these different desires for these 2 languages, and both of them are kind of important to me for different reasons. And you know, both of them felt like if I were to hold off, if I were to wait, there could be these huge missed opportunities. So let's just learn them at the same time. Why wait for either of them? If I really want to learn both of them, I'm really motivated, I'm passionate, I love them, why not? Like, it's my decision. I can just do it. It is like the end of the day here, so the sun is like shifting a lot in the sky, and I keep trying to adjust the settings and I give up. So if I look like my face coloring or the brightness on this is like constantly shifting, that's why. Whatever, it's nature. I cannot control the universe. So the key with learning multiple languages at the same time is just to find a balance that works for you. And in order to find that balance, you need to understand like what your goals are with both of the languages. You could just say, hey, I want to learn these 2 languages and I just want to divide my time 50-50. And you can do that. But, you know, it's also okay to say, you know, I want to learn them both at the same time, but this one's a little bit more priority, so I'll spend a little bit more of my time on this one, and then, you know, I'll work on this one a little bit too. Also, you know, logistics and stuff, like you might wonder, should I have one day is, you know, in my case, Hungarian, one day is Japanese, or each day, should I do a little bit of Hungarian and a little bit of Japanese? And then if you're going to do both languages in the same day, like you also have to consider, I mean, this is something I consider, is which language will you do first? Because, for example, like let's say you start focusing on one language, you sit down, you start studying that one. Sometimes you get like really wrapped up into what you're doing and you end up not really having time for the second language. Or like you kind of do something and you're very focused, and when it comes time to the second language, you don't really have a lot of time left for that one. Basically, there's really no right or wrong way to how to balance the 2 languages. It's all up to you. You just need to ask yourself some important questions to understand what would be the best way for you to balance those languages. You know, the best part about studying 2 languages at the same time is that it makes it a lot easier to not get bored. And what I mean is, like, let's say you are really interested in your 2 languages. You know, I might go through periods where I'm like super into Japanese, and so every time I sit down, I'm like, let's start with the Japanese, and it will like really rev me up, and I'm excited to sit down and study Japanese, and I just get all that fun Japanese out of the way, and then I move on to Hungarian. And maybe I don't spend as much on Hungarian, which is fine, you know, moving the needle. But then at some point, that kind of excitement for Japanese might shift. I might be like, I focus on Japanese so much lately, like, I'm not really in the mood for Japanese. And I'm like, Hungarian, let's focus on Hungarian. And then I'll go through a period where Hungarian is more important to me, and I'll sit down and get really excited and work on Hungarian. And then when I'm done, I will use that excitement and like that dopamine from my Hungarian studies to, you know, do something in Japanese. And this way it's kind of like, you know, like Japanese, Hungarian, hand flaps. I don't know why we're doing this, but there's still balance going on and momentum in both languages. But I'm not getting bored. And there's always this feeling of novelty and excitement because things are always changing. And then also sometimes like you're just really tired of one language and you just want to break from it. So you could like take a whole week off from one language and just spend that week on the other language, and then kind of swap it the following week. So how this looks for me on a typical week with mainly Japanese and Hungarian is, because I am more of a morning person, I like to get up early and I do some studying in the morning before work. You don't have to do this. This is not me saying that you have to get up early to study. Just that's the time of day that I like to study. So for me, I wake up, I do 20 to 30 minutes of maybe Japanese and then 20 to 30 minutes of Hungarian. So about an hour divided by the 2 languages. It's never perfectly 50-50. Sometimes one takes up more time and the other one takes less. But basically what I'll do is I'll decide which language is my priority that day, and that will be the language I study first, because the language I study first, sometimes I go over the 30 minutes, and the second language doesn't get as much time because I gotta go to work. Because I constantly just kind of keep track of what language I have been prioritizing overall. You know, if I did Japanese first Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm gonna do Hungarian first, and then Thursday I'll probably do Hungarian first again. And then Friday I will be like, you know, I did both 50-50, so on Friday I'll just choose whichever one I want to do first. And then after work, you have to understand, like, I'm a freelancer, I don't work full time, so I have a lot of extra time some days of the week, not all. But because of that, sometimes after work, when I have like extra time, I might do additional studying. But to me, that's not so much like my daily study routine. That's more of like just icing on the cake, like, because I have the time and I'm in the mood. And if I do have extra time, I will just focus on whichever language that I'm more in the mood for that week. I could be balancing languages really well in the morning, but then after work be like the whole week could be Japanese or the whole week could be Hungarian. And like, I'm not really bothered by that because I don't want to like restrict myself to like a very strict routine. I do kind of want to follow the passion and follow just where my heart is in the moment. And then for me, I personally don't really study languages so much on the weekend. If I do, I will just do what I'm in the mood for, to be honest. My core like blocks of like dedicated study time is that hour before work, Monday to Friday. And so as long as that Monday to Friday hour is balanced, I'm happy. And then like after work, the weekend, anything extra that I do, I don't really care which language I focus on. I just follow my heart and do what I want to do. But at the end of the day, I really believe that there is no point holding off learning a language just because somebody out there said you can't learn multiple languages at the same time. If you want to wait, that's your prerogative. You can totally wait. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you are someone who really cannot decide between two languages, you really want to study them both, you're very passionate about both, you don't want to wait for either one, this is me telling you, don't wait. Go do what you want. If you love those two languages and you want to do them both, it doesn't matter if people say that it's hard. It doesn't matter if there might be moments where you might mix them up. Who cares? Like, it doesn't have to be a perfect road. It just has to be something that you enjoy doing, and why wait to do something you enjoy? So go study those languages, and I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.